The desert was not just a place of silence, it was a living thing, watching, breathing, waiting. It held its heat like a secret too heavy to release, its cracked earth whispering the stories of those who came before and vanished without a trace. And into this endless stretch of red and gold she walked, carrying within her not just the weight of her body, but the fragile seed of hope still clinging to her heart. Every breath was fire, every step a wound. Yet she pressed on, because to stop meant surrendering her story to the dust. Her name was Sarah, and though the world had betrayed her, she still clung to the tender memory of love, a love that once promised forever, but dissolved into ash the moment cruelty showed its face. She had been abandoned with nothing but a broken wagon, a torn dress, and a belly swollen with new life. The betrayal cut deeper than the desert sun, deeper than the thirst cracking her lips, deeper even than the fear of death. For it was not only her life at stake, it was the lives of those tiny, silent souls waiting for her courage to carry them into existence. The air trembled with heat, and the horizon shimmered like a dream that always slipped away. Vultures circled high above, shadows against the merciless sky, and still she whispered words of comfort to herself, words that were less about survival and more about refusing to surrender her spirit. In the stillness between contractions, she remembered her husband's gentle smile, the way he once traced her freckles with tender devotion, and how life had seemed full of healing light back then. Now those memories felt like treasures buried deep beneath the sand, untouchable, unreachable, yet still capable of warming her heart when everything else was cold. She stumbled, her knees grazing the hot stone, but even there she refused to cry. The tears would have only stolen the water her body so desperately needed. Instead, she closed her eyes and thought of green fields she once knew, the way grass brushed her fingertips when she was a child running barefoot across Pennsylvania meadows. That memory rose like a balm, a soft, healing salve against the burning pain of the present. A sound startled her, faint at first, then clearer, the eerie cry of coyotes. She pulled her torn shawl tighter, a small, meaningless gesture against the vast wilderness, and whispered to her unborn children, "I will not let the world break you before you even take your first breath." She had no proof that her words held power, but saying them made her feel less alone. The sun slid lower, painting the sky in bruised shades of crimson, and with it came the next wave of agony. She sank into the shadow of the broken wagon, gripping the wooden frame as if it were a lifeline. Her body convulsed, sharp knives of pain searing through her core, and she realized the time had come. There would be no midwife, no gentle hand, no whispered prayers from women who knew the rhythm of birth. There was only the earth, the fire in her blood, and the will to see her children safe. Her breath came ragged, but her mind fought to stay clear. She spread the few blankets she had salvaged, arranged strips of cloth with trembling fingers, and clutched the knife she had hidden in her boot. A last defense, though against what she did not know. She thought of her mother's voice, soothing her in childhood storms, and imagined it now like a hymn of healing drifting across the desert. It steadied her as another contraction tore through her. The first cry was a miracle. A thin, defiant wail rose into the cooling night, louder than the coyotes, louder than the silence, louder than the death that lingered so close. Sarah wept then, not out of weakness, but of awe, wrapping the tiny body in the last clean scrap of fabric she had. She pressed him to her chest, breathing in the raw, holy scent of new life. "Henry," she whispered, naming him for the father who once taught her strength. But there was no time to rest, for pain surged again, sharper, deeper, threatening to break what little was left of her resolve. She cried out into the vastness, voice hoarse, body trembling, as the second child fought his way into the world. This one came smaller, quieter, his cry fragile but real. She named him James, and as she held him close, she knew that in this barren, merciless place, love had still chosen to bloom. Yet, as she lay back, exhausted and bleeding, she felt her strength slipping away like water through her fingers. The night grew colder, and her vision blurred at the edges. She thought, "Perhaps this is the end. Perhaps my children will live only to be claimed by the desert." The thought broke her heart, yet even in despair she refused to let go of hope. She pressed her lips to each tiny forehead, whispering blessings, willing healing into their fragile bodies. And then, in the twilight between life and death, she saw it, a figure on horseback, cutting across the horizon. Her heart thudded, torn between fear and desperate yearning. Was this salvation, or the final cruelty? The rider drew nearer, tall in the saddle, his hair braided and catching the last light of the fading sun. She could not move, only clutch her sons closer, her heart pounding with both terror and hope. The horse slowed, hooves crunching against the brittle earth, and the man dismounted. He approached without haste, his hands visible, his movements deliberate. His eyes held neither pity nor malice, only calm. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, his English broken but kind. "You hurt?" The words cut through her delirium like a thread of healing. She tried to answer, but could only laugh, the sound brittle and sharp. "Yes," she breathed, "I am hurt." The stranger knelt, not too close, respecting the fragile line between them. "Babies," he said softly, nodding at the tiny bundles pressed to her chest. His tone carried no judgment, only acknowledgement. When she whispered that they were her sons, his gaze softened, as if he too carried memories of love and loss. He offered her water, the sweetest she had ever tasted, and for the first time since the sun had risen, she felt her body ease. It was not safety, not yet, but it was possibility. And possibility was more healing than any miracle. She did not know his name yet. She did not know his past, his wounds, or why fate had placed him in her path at this exact moment. All she knew was that he had not turned away. And in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty, that single act of staying was already enough to stitch the first threads of trust. The desert night deepened, and as the stars opened above, she realized this was not an ending. And it was the beginning of something far greater than survival. Somewhere between grief and grace, pain and healing, despair and tender hope, a story had just been born. Hers, his, and the lives of the two children who had bound them together before a single word of love had ever been spoken. And as you read these words, as you walk with her beneath the same stars, may you feel that same quiet strength settling in your own heart. If this moment touched you, let your heart linger here a little longer. Leave a comment to share what it stirred in you. Offer a like if you felt the warmth in her resilience. And subscribe so you can walk with us through every chapter yet to come. Every gesture, no matter how small, is a healing thread, weaving all of us closer together in stories that remind us, even in the darkest deserts, love will always find a way. The night grew colder, yet inside her chest, warmth blossomed. She closed her eyes, listening to the stranger's low voice as he murmured to the twins in words she could not understand. The cadence was steady, like a prayer, like a promise. And as her exhaustion pulled her towards sleep, Sarah let go of fear, knowing that somehow, against every cruel intention of the world, she and her children were no longer alone. The morning broke with a tender hush, the kind of silence that seemed less like emptiness and more like reverence. Dawn spilled its first colors across the desert sky, a soft wash of rose and amber that brushed over the jagged peaks and stretched down to the broken wagon where Sarah lay weak but alive. The stranger had tended to the fire through the night, his figure moving in quiet rhythm as though he had known a lifetime of such watches. She drifted in and out of consciousness, waking to the sound of him murmuring words to her sons in a tongue she did not understand, a language that seemed older than the earth itself. Yet even without meaning, his voice carried the healing weight of comfort, the way lullabies soothe even when words are lost to time. When she stirred, the twins tucked close against her. The stranger's eyes met hers. He did not smile, nor did he frown, but his gaze was steady, like the calm surface of water after a storm. He gestured gently for her to drink again from the water skin, and though her body trembled with weakness, she obeyed. The liquid was life itself, and she felt strength creeping slowly back into her veins. She whispered a thank you, her voice no stronger than a sigh. He nodded once, as though gratitude required no words, only recognition. By the time the sun climbed high, he had fashioned a sling from his own blanket, securing the twins against his chest with surprising tenderness. Sarah watched as their tiny bodies molded into the safety of his hold, soothed into rare silence by the rhythm of his breath. A pang of awe moved through her, as if she were witnessing something sacred, the merging of strength and gentleness in a single act. Mounting his horse was no easy task with her body still raw from birth, but he lifted her with care, not as a man lifts a burden, but as one carrying something precious, irreplaceable. The world swayed beneath her for a moment, and she gripped the saddle horn, her vision blurring, but the sound of her sons against his chest steadied her. He walked beside the horse, hand firm on the reins, his pace deliberate, his body a silent shield between her and the vastness of the desert. Hours stretched into an endless trail of dust and stone. At times, her mind wandered back to Pennsylvania fields and gentle summers, to her husband's smile before it soured under his father's shadow. She thought of Thomas, gone too soon, and of the cruel patriarch whose greed had led her here. Bitterness stirred like ashes, but the steady presence of the man walking at her side kept despair from devouring her whole. Every step he took seemed to say, wordlessly, "You are not alone now." That was a healing in itself. As dusk approached, they descended into a valley she had not seen before, where scrub pines clung stubbornly to the soil and a thin thread of water sparkled in the fading light. It was there he paused, lifting the twins from the sling and placing them gently beside her. With skilled hands he built a fire, coaxing flame from flint and dry grass until warmth blossomed in the gathering night. He spoke only when necessary, his words simple, but the silences between them were not heavy. They were alive, filled with the unspoken promise that safety, however fragile, still existed. The medicine woman's lodge awaited them deeper in his people's camp, but for that first night, Sarah knew only this: his care was her lifeline. As the fire crackled and shadows danced along the rocks, he sat near, sharpening a blade, but never letting his attention stray far from her or the children. She watched him with wary gratitude, her heart pulled in strange directions she could not yet name. Grief and relief mingled, shaping something raw and new within her. When at last they reached the encampment days later, it felt less like intrusion and more like stepping into a world carved from earth and sky. The teepees stood proud in a circle, their hides painted with symbols she could not decipher but felt in her spirit. Dogs barked, and children ran to see the strangers return, their curious eyes falling upon the pale woman and her two fragile boys. Fear tightened her chest, but the stranger's steady hand at her side anchored her. He spoke in his language, his tone firm, and the crowd parted. The medicine woman appeared then, her hair white as snow, her gaze piercing yet kind. She led Sarah inside her lodge, where the air was thick with the scent of herbs and smoke. There, healing began in earnest. Bitter teas pressed to her lips, poultices against her wounds. The old woman's voice chanting words that seemed to bind body and spirit back together. Sarah felt herself surrender to care, something she had not known since before her husband's death. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that maybe she and her sons were meant to live. Days passed, blurred by rest and recovery. Her sons thrived in their cradleboard, swaddled in furs softer than anything she had ever touched. Women came to check on her, some wary, others curious, one or two offering shy smiles. A young girl taught her words in their tongue: heart, child, water, and Sarah repeated them clumsily, her voice shaky but eager. Language, she discovered, was more than sound. It was a bridge, and every word she learned was a stone placed across the gulf between her and them. At night, when the lodge grew quiet, she often heard the stranger, Chatan, as she now knew his name, speaking with the medicine woman outside, their voices low, carrying weight she could not understand. Once she caught her own name woven between their syllables, and her heart leapt. She wondered what they said of her. Did they see her as burden or blessing? Did they regret saving her, or did they believe her survival carried some meaning beyond her knowing? Fear was never far, for she knew the world had not forgotten her. Jeremiah Reynolds' men could still be searching. Soldiers could still stumble upon this place. Her presence could still bring ruin upon those who had offered her sanctuary. Yet even in the shadow of dread, light grew. It grew in the way Kimla, the medicine woman's granddaughter, placed food into her hands without judgment. It grew in the way Chatan, silent as the night, always ensured her fire burned strong. It grew most of all in the way her sons were accepted, passed from arm to arm, touched with gentle fingers, whispered over as though they too belonged. One evening, she sat at the edge of the fire with Chatan beside her, the twins nestled safely between them. The sky above was a vast cathedral of stars, brighter than any she had ever known. She whispered aloud, more to herself than to him, "I don't know what tomorrow will bring." For a long time he said nothing. Then, in his quiet, measured voice, he replied, "Tomorrow always comes. We walk it together or alone, better together." The words settled into her chest like balm, simple, unadorned, yet they carried the healing weight of truth. She turned her gaze to him, his profile carved against the firelight, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt the fragile stirrings of hope that maybe her heart could still open again. Her decision was not yet made, for the path ahead remained uncertain. But as the flames flickered and her son slept peacefully, Sarah realized that whatever her future held, she was no longer a woman abandoned to the desert. She was part of something larger, something woven from pain and tenderness, survival and grace. And as she leaned back against the earth, cradled by firelight and stars, she whispered to her children that the world, though cruel, still held healing places, still offered the chance to begin anew. The night deepened, but peace remained, not fragile, but steady, as though it had taken root. And from that moment, her story was no longer only about loss. It was about the quiet miracle of being found, and the even greater miracle of learning to belong again. Days gathered softly at the edge of the valley, and life began to wrap itself around Sarah the way a shawl catches and keeps warmth. Morning came with the low hum of voices, the flap of hides, the handsome order of a camp already in motion before the sun crested the ridge. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and sage, the twins nuzzling for milk with a determination that made her smile even when her body still ached. Kimla slipped in with a steaming bowl and a murmur, words Sarah was learning by sound before meaning, then propped her with care, smoothing the blanket as if guarding something precious. The small, daily tenderness was a healing in itself, an invisible thread weaving her into a net that would not let her fall. The medicine woman moved like weather, gentle one moment, sudden and sure the next. She laid cool hands against Sarah's forehead, spoke to the twins as if they were old souls disguised in tiny bodies, and taught her how to breathe differently when pain came like a tide. The herbs were bitter, but she drank without protest, tasting bark and dusk and a secret sweetness that arrived at the end like forgiveness. In the quiet between instructions, a voice outside would braid into the ordinary sounds, the cadence familiar now, the low consonants that belonged to the man who had lifted her from the desert. He never rushed when he spoke to the elders. He did not plead. He set his words down like stones across a stream, and others tested them with their weight. When she was strong enough to stand, the lodge's shadow fell away like a shed skin. Wind threaded her hair, carrying the clean scent of the creek and the pine's resin song. Children stopped their game to point at the twins. A grey dog with one white ear came solemnly to sit by her knee as if assigned. She laughed softly, surprised by the sound, and the dog tilted its head as though surprised in return. That afternoon, Kimla took her to the water. Not the hot springs that steamed like a dream caught in earth's breath, those would come another day, but the ribbon of creek where smooth stones held sunlight and small silver fish arrowed between shadows. They washed cloth there, palms pressing and lifting in a rhythm that made time gentle. A woman with laughter in her eyes stood shoulder to shoulder with Sarah and, without words, showed her how to twist and rinse in the current. When she got it wrong, the woman nodded as if wrong was only another step on the right road. The chatter rose and fell around them like birdsong. Sometimes a phrase would land in Sarah's ear and stay long enough to be repeated later to the twins, a new shape in her mouth tasting of belonging. By evening she could walk to the fire without dizziness. He was there on a low log, mending the leather on a bridle, the work of his hands a quiet language she already respected. Shatan. She had practiced his name in the hush of the lodge until it felt like a prayer at the back of her throat, lifted his gaze as she approached. He didn't stand, didn't hurry to fuss as if she might break. He made room beside him, which was its own kind of welcome. The twins slept in the cradle board near the heat, cheeks flushed, lashes dark commas against their skin. 3 stars, she said softly, tapping the sky where evening had just begun to write itself in light. She held up 3 fingers. 3, she repeated, then haltingly tried the new word Kimla had taught her. Chatan's mouth touched its first smile of the day. Yamni, he offered, and waited while she tried it twice more until the shape felt right. Good, he said at last, not as a teacher grading a child, but as a man honoring effort. The word settled over her shoulders like a shawl, warmed from someone else's fire. The council called him later, and she watched him go with the curious ache that comes when a part of you has already stepped to match another's stride. She did not follow. This was not a place where she could insert herself with the bluntness of fear. Still, her chest knew the pulse of that meeting, heard it in the lowered voices of women carrying water, in the way the dogs lifted their heads and then slept again. The elders had a way of listening that felt like watching the river for what moves beneath the surface. She learned from their stillness. It was not all softness. There were eyes that measured her and found questions. An older man paused in front of her one afternoon, his hair bound with a strip of cloth the color of dried cherry. He studied the twins a long time, then Sarah. He said a handful of words, low and steady, and waited. She shook her head, spread her hands to show she had not understood. He nodded, said them again, slower, placing each one like a bead in her palm. She repeated them carefully. On the last, her tongue stumbled. He repeated just that one until she could hold it without dropping it. Then he touched 2 fingers to his chest and gave his name. She spoke it back, and something eased in his face. Not quite a smile, more like the gentle collapse of an old wall. He left her with a piece of dried meat wrapped in clean hide. That night, she shared it with Kimla and the grey dog, who pretended not to angle for it until the last possible moment. There was work, and in work there is dignity. She learned to scrape a hide with a shoulder blade worn to a smooth curve, learning the stroke that made the fibers sigh free. She learned to grind roots to powder, the mortar's rhythm a steady drum beneath the torque. She learned to bead, not with a pattern borrowed, but with one given, blue triangles stepping into white, a small geometry of promise. When her stitches wavered, Kimla touched her wrist, and the line steadied. They hummed sometimes, not a song exactly, more the sound people make when their hands are busy and their hearts are not alone. At dusk, the men returned from the ridge with dust on their boots and news in their eyes. Chatan's shoulders were tired, but not bowed. He moved like a man who understands a long road and walks it anyway. He knelt by the cradle board, and the twins, knowing his scent already, stirred, small mouths making the shape of hunger. He glanced at Sarah then, not to ask permission, not to claim, only to share that moment the way one shares bread. She lifted a child, settled him against her breast, and the rhythm of life, simple and sufficient, filled the spaces that fear had chewed ragged. Time did what time does in places that still belong to the wind. It unfolded without hurry. Days braided themselves into a cord she could hold. Seasons did not change, not yet, but she could feel their promise in the slant of light. In the particular way dawn came through the pines, more gold one morning, more silver the next. She found that the earth's small differences were a language too, and she was becoming literate. One night the medicine woman took Sarah's hands into her own and turned them palm up. Lines, scars, a life's map that had been recharted by grief and grit. The elder traced no fortune there, she traced presence. Strong, she said, in the English she kept, like a knife's bright edge for when it mattered. Mother strong. She touched the twins' foreheads in turn. These little ones, good spirits. The words did not require belief for their balm to work. They laid a gentle weight on Sarah's lungs and made breath easier. The first storm after her arrival carried rain that did not ask permission. It came over the ridge with a grey hem, then fell broad and honest, drumming the lodges, flattening the dust, beading every blade of grass with light. Children stamped in puddles, dogs shook and sneezed and shook again. Sarah stood at the lodge edge with the twins bundled close, the wet air cool against her face. Shatan crossed the clearing to her. Water braided in his hair, glassed his lashes. He handed her a second blanket without comment. The gesture was not grand, but her body remembered it later when fear crept near, the way a small kindness can make a long darkness bearable. When the skies cleared, the world smelled new. She walked with Kimla to a stand of birch to gather bark the old way. Never from the living skin in a wound too deep, always from fallen curls the tree surrendered. Kimla showed her how to tuck the strips into a woven bag. She showed Kimla how to fold cloth diapers so they held better through the night. Exchange for exchange. Each woman looked at the other and saw not a stranger, but a person carrying burdens and making mourning anyway. From time to time, riders watched the far plains. Sometimes they returned with nothing but horizon caught in their pupils. Sometimes they returned with a rumor. Men in uniform stopping at homesteads, questions that smelled of maps. A wagon with the Reynolds brand passing too close to a trading post. A pair of scouts turning their horses away at the sight of smoke. The camp was a living thing. It tightened its belt, redistributed weight, shortened fires, practiced a silence deeper than fear. Yet joy did not evacuate. It simply learned to step softly, to laugh with its hand over its mouth when laughter would carry too far. One evening, when the moon rose thin as a thread pulled through dark cloth, they gathered around a steady fire for a small ceremony that was not the naming yet, but the beginning of one. The medicine woman taught Sarah to bless smoke with her hands, to draw it in toward her heart, toward the twins, and then to let it rise. The twins opened their fists as if to hold the air. The elder sang something low, not a melody Sarah knew, and the sound stitched into her bones like a promise that the past would always be hers and the future did not have to be a repeat. After the song, Shatan placed a small object on the ground between them, something wrapped in buckskin and tied with a thong. He did not push it across as a man shoves a trade. He set it down as a man offers a bridge. When she untied it, her fingers found a beadwork piece no larger than the twins' palms, blue triangles in white. The pattern she had been practicing, but clean, true, without her wobble. In its center, a tiny circle of red, the exact heart of a berry in summer. She looked up, and the world tilted, not with fear, but with the dizzy recognition of being seen. He had made time for this, or found it, and either way, that mattered more than the object itself. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried more freight than gratitude for a gift. They carried days of food placed quietly near her fire, and the watch he kept without being asked, and the way he did not tell her how to be one thing or another. He nodded, the corner of his mouth a breath from a smile, and the fire found a way to glow a little warmer. The next morning, the medicine woman took Sarah farther than she had yet gone, to a rise of ground that let her see the valley's shape. It lay cupped in the mountain's hands, a place to rest inside the old ribs of the earth. "Here," the elder said, tapping the ground with the tip of her staff. "Listen." At first, Sarah heard only wind, a hawk's cry stitched thin, the faint clink of a horse somewhere below. Then, as her breathing slowed and her mind laid down its old sword, she heard the low note a country makes when it loves its people, the hum of insects, the weight of trees, the long whisper of water running over stone. A deep, slow sound, the valley's pulse. She closed her eyes, and it moved through her own ribs like a second heartbeat. When they returned, she walked differently. Not with ownership, this land was not hers to claim as property, but with kinship, the way one moves in a relative's house, careful and easeful at once. That night she told the twins, in a voice almost too soft to hear, that even if they left someday, they would carry the valley in their bodies. "You will know where you are," she whispered, "even in the dark." The babies sighed the way babies do when milk turns to sleep and sleep turns to a deeper safety. She brushed their hair with her fingertips and felt something unclench in her chest that she had been holding since the day she learned she was carrying 2 lives. The elders chose a day for the naming. Preparations began with the same unhurried seriousness she remembered from harvests back home. 1,000 small tasks done well, none of them loud. Sarah sewed in the afternoon sun, guiding a needle through soft tanned leather to make small moccasins that might last 1 moon, 2 at most. Kimla corrected her stitches without judgment. Sarah corrected Kimla's folding of diapers without pride. In the margin between those 2 corrections, Love learned a dialect it had not spoken before. On the eve of the ceremony, Chatan found her near the creek, washing the last cloth for mourning. The light had gone to honey. He stood on the bank and said her name carefully, as if holding something delicate. Every time he said it, he remade it, not the way her father said it, not the way her husband had said it, with tired affection and later with a restless edge, but with a patience that suggested he believed names should grow into their bodies. He joined her at the water, rolled his sleeves, and washed a strip of cloth with a seriousness that made them both laugh. The sound startled a trout, a silver flash that rippled away like a good omen. "Tomorrow," he said in English, the word weighed, chosen. "The people will speak for your sons." He did not say what she already knew, that this speaking was also a binding, that words could be ropes that held or bridges that welcomed. "You are." He searched the darkening air for the right word. "Strong," he finished, and the pause made the simple word feel like a chant. "You stand with them. With us." She looked at their hands in the water, his larger, steadier, her own thinner, but no longer shaking. A thought came and startled her with its brightness. "I have been carried, and I am learning to carry back." She lifted her gaze and met his. "Together," she said. It was not a vow, not a plea. It was an honest map of where they stood now. 2 people not rushed by hunger or fear into the wrong promise. two people letting a living thing grow in the space between their fires. That night a wind came down off the ridge and combed the valley. The lodges whispered. Horses nicked softly, dreaming of distance. The twins slept in a braided reed basket that a laughing woman had insisted on making once she saw how Sarah admired the first one. Sarah lay on her side facing them, her hand on the basket's rim, feeling in the bone of her palm the minute tremors of their breath. Outside she heard a coyote call, lonely, then answered. Something in her that had been calling for months, longer, felt answered too. Morning would bring names spoken into steam, into smoke, into the bright air. Morning would seat her among women who had known hunger and harvest, exile and return. Morning would let the elders lift her sons to the sun and say, "We see you," which is another way of saying, "Live." There might be danger beyond the ridge today or next week. There might be riders or papers, maps that made lies look official. But danger no longer had the first word or the last. Between those two, life had set a table and laid out bread. Before sleep claimed her, she told the twins a story without beginning or end. A circle of words soft as the inside of a wrist. It was about a field of grass she once ran through, and a river she had just learned to hear, and a man who walked beside a horse at the speed of trust. It was about hands that healed and hands that learned, and about how families sometimes are stitched not by names or bloodlines, but by the steady habit of showing up when the fire needs tending. She spoke until the story warmed the air and made a haven of the small space between heartbeats. When the stars settled into their high, clear places, the last thought before sleep was not a plan or a fear, but a quiet certainty. Love, the kind that does not rush and does not vanish with the first hard weather, had entered the camp as gently as dawn. It had not asked to be announced. It had simply taken off its shoes, cleaned its hands in the creek, and begun to help with the work. And so the night thinned, and morning brightened, and the valley lifted its steady pulse to meet the day that would name two boys and braid their lives into the story already waiting for them, where the next steps, hers, his, theirs, would carry them toward the ridge, and whatever the horizon meant by home. The morning of the naming dawned bright and still, the sky stretching wide and endless as though it had been washed clean overnight. Sarah woke to the gentle rustle of hides being lifted, the smell of herbs burning low in the fire, and the soft coo of her twins as they stirred beside her. Her body was stronger now, no longer the fragile vessel of pain it had been weeks ago, though she still carried the deep weariness of one who had walked through fire and barely emerged whole. Yet within that weariness lived a quiet flame of hope, the kind that no storm could snuff out. Outside the lodge, the camp was alive with preparation. Women arranged bundles of berries, strips of dried meat, and fresh bread made from ground roots. Children darted among the lodges, their laughter threading into the air like ribbons. Warriors painted their faces with streaks of ochre and charcoal, symbols of strength and protection. Sarah sat in silence, cradling Henry and James, feeling the gravity of the day settle into her chest. Today, her sons would be spoken into this world, named not only by her heart, but by the people who had taken them in. Kimla entered with garments folded across her arms. One was a dress of soft deerskin, its surface beaded in patient patterns of blue and white. The other two were tiny tunics, no larger than her hands, stitched for the twins. Sarah's throat tightened as she touched the beadwork, each stitch a prayer, each pattern a promise. She dressed slowly, reverently, as though clothing herself not only in fabric, but in the trust that had been extended to her. The ceremony began near the springs, where steam rose in ethereal tendrils, curling into the morning air like the breath of the earth. The circle of people gathered, their faces solemn yet warm, their eyes turned not with suspicion, but with welcome. At the center, the medicine woman, her hair white, her eyes keen with wisdom, stood waiting. Chatan was near, his presence steady as always, not speaking, not claiming, only standing like a tree whose roots held the ground firm beneath her feet. Sarah stepped forward, the twins bundled against her chest. The medicine woman raised her arms, calling to the sky, to the water, to the unseen spirits who lingered in the spaces between. Then she took Henry first, lifting him high so that the sun might see his face. Her voice, strong though aged, filled the circle with words Sarah did not understand, but she felt them in her bones. When the words ended, she placed a streak of red ochre across the boy's brow and declared a name. Ogle Gleska, Spotted Eagle. The people repeated it, their voices weaving the name into memory. James was lifted next, smaller, more fragile, but with a spark in his eyes that seemed older than his days. The medicine woman spoke softer this time, her chant carrying a lilt like the song of wind through pine. She traced a star on his brow with white clay and named him Wichhapi Hinghang, Rising Star. Again the people echoed the name, and Sarah wept, her tears falling not from sorrow, but from a healing joy she had thought she would never feel again. Her sons were no longer shadows cast by betrayal. They were light, recognized, cherished. The feast followed, simple but abundant. The food passed hand to hand, the laughter rising like smoke into the sky. Elders laid blessings upon the twins, warriors touched their tiny hands, women cooed at their smallness as if to anchor them in affection. Sarah sat between Kimla and the medicine woman, watching as her sons were carried from one arm to another, accepted without question, without hesitation. And through the blur of faces she saw Chatan, standing apart as he often did, his gaze fixed on the children with an expression she could not yet name. It was not pity, not even simple fondness. It was something deeper, like recognition, as though he saw in them the echo of something he had once lost and was learning to find again. That evening, when the fire glowed low and the songs had faded into murmurs, Sarah stepped outside her lodge. The twins slept in their cradle, their breaths rising in even rhythm. The valley stretched before her, vast and endless, yet no longer frightening. She felt arms brush against her sleeve and turned to find Chatan there. He carried no weapons now, only the quiet dignity that followed him always. "You stood strong," he said softly, his English halting yet sure. "They are ours now." His words fell like balm, and Sarah felt a warmth rise through her chest. Not ownership, not possession, belonging. She nodded, unable to speak past the tide of emotion. The stars crowded overhead, brighter than she had ever known them, and in that moment she realized that though tomorrow might bring danger, betrayal, or loss, tonight was whole, complete, and healing. She turned her face to him, her eyes shimmering in the firelight, and whispered the only word that mattered: "Together." The silence that followed was not empty. It was a promise, waiting, patient as the land itself. And as the fire burned low and the camp settled into sleep, Sarah knew that her story, once fractured and abandoned in the desert, was being rewritten in the quiet, steady rhythm of this place, where love did not rush, but grew like roots, slow and certain, reaching deep into the soil of tomorrow. The valley did not hold still for long. Life was a current, and even in the sanctuary of the sacred springs, the current pressed forward, carrying with it whispers of danger. Sarah felt the shift before she was told. It was in the way the women packed their bundles more carefully, in the sharper glances of the warriors at the ridges, in the hush that fell when a horse's distant call echoed too near. The naming ceremony had wrapped her sons in a cloak of belonging, but belonging did not shield them from the world beyond the mountains. At dawn one morning, a rider returned with dust thick on his clothes and urgency in his voice. Though Sarah could not catch the meaning, she knew it was grave. Shatan's face was unreadable, carved in stone as he listened, but the tautness of his jaw told her enough. He did not come to her immediately, but she saw how his eyes drifted again and again to where Henry and James lay sleeping in the cradle-board. That night, after council had ended, he sat beside her outside the lodge. The fire was low, the air cool with the promise of autumn. "Men look," he said finally, his English careful. "White men. 3. They find the wagon where you—" He searched for the word, and she whispered, "Where I was left." He nodded, his gaze steady. "They follow. Maybe come here." The blood drained from her face. She clutched the cradle-board closer, pressing her lips to the soft crowns of her sons. For a moment, fear swallowed her whole. But then Shatan's hand, warm and steady, touched her arm. "We make no fear for little ones," he said, a quiet authority in his tone. "We hide trail. We move." His presence was a healing in itself, a reminder that she was no longer standing alone in a desert of betrayal. The camp moved like water, swift and sure. Teepees folded, packs lashed, children gathered. Elders were guided onto ponies, bundles balanced across travois. Sarah rode in the makeshift cradle that Shatan had crafted, her sons swaddled tight against her chest. Each step of the horse carried her farther from the ashes of her past and deeper into a new life, though shadows still trailed them. The path grew harsh as they climbed into the mountains, the air thin and cool, the forest closing around them with the scent of pine and earth. The twins fussed, restless with the jostling, and Sarah soothed them with fragments of lullabies from her childhood, songs of meadows and rivers. Sometimes, when exhaustion dulled her voice, she heard another tone pick up where hers faltered, a low, steady hum. Shatan's. He walked beside her horse, one hand steady on the rein, his other resting against the sling where he carried water and herbs. His voice was not melodic, but it was grounding, a healing sound that settled even her own frayed nerves. At night, no fires were lit. They camped beneath the thick cover of trees, the stars hidden by branches, the air sharp with silence. Sarah held her sons close, their tiny bodies warm against her own, and listened to the soft murmurs of women nearby, to the watchful tread of warriors keeping guard. Each dawn they rose again, pressing deeper into the wilderness, leaving behind no trace for pursuers to find. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the mountains in gold, Sarah stumbled while dismounting. Pain flared in her body, the lingering ache of childbirth and the strain of travel. She would have fallen had Shatan not caught her, his arms strong around her waist. For a moment, she leaned into him, breathless, her cheek near his shoulder, her heart pounding not only with fear, but with a startling, fragile warmth. His grip did not linger longer than it needed to, but when he released her, the echo of it remained. The next day, a scout brought word that riders still followed. 3 men, armed, relentless. Fear gnawed at Sarah again, but she saw how the band adapted. False trails were laid, paths doubled back, routes wound through canyons too narrow for easy pursuit. Even the land seemed to conspire to protect them, the mountains closing like guardians, streams running clear as though to wash away their passing. Yet danger did not vanish, and each cry of her sons felt to Sarah like a flare against the silence, calling out to those who hunted them. The medicine woman gave her a small pouch of powder, instructing her with gestures to dab the tiniest bit onto her finger and let the babies suck when their cries grew too sharp. "Sleep," the old woman said simply. The first time Sarah tried it, guilt knotted in her chest, but when Henry and James drifted into soft, peaceful slumber, she felt relief wash over her like cool water. Healing was not always gentle. Sometimes it meant choices made in desperation. At last, they reached a plateau ringed by pines, a place where they could rest and watch the valleys below. From there, Sarah saw the faint glow of a campfire far in the distance, and her stomach turned cold. The pursuers were near. That night she could not sleep. She sat beside the twins, her eyes fixed on the horizon, while Chatan kept vigil nearby. When she whispered, "They will never stop," his gaze shifted to her, steady and unyielding. "They stop," he said, "or they fall." The words carried no boast, no threat, only fact. She studied his face, shadowed by moonlight, and saw the scars of old battles, the lines etched by grief, the quiet fire of resilience. For the first time, she wondered not only what he had lost, but what he still dreamed of, what hopes still smouldered beneath the ash of sorrow. When dawn broke, the camp moved again, weaving through narrow trails that only the people knew. They descended into a hidden valley where hot springs rose in curling steam, where ancient pines stood sentinel, their roots deep as time itself. It was there they paused, gathering strength, cleansing wounds, letting the healing waters restore them. Sarah lowered her sons into the warm pool, guided by Kimla, and watched their tiny limbs relax, their eyes drifting shut. The steam wrapped around her like a benediction, and she felt her body ease in a way it had not since before Thomas's death. She closed her eyes and let herself believe, if only for a moment, that she and her sons might grow here, that peace might last longer than a breath. But peace was a fragile thing, and she knew better than to clutch it too tightly. Still, in the arms of the valley, with Chatan's watchful presence near, and the people moving around her with acceptance instead of judgment, she found something more precious than certainty. She found the strength to hope. Night fell, and the firelight flickered across faces that had become familiar. Songs rose, low and steady, not the wild revel of triumph, but the gentle music of endurance. Sarah sat with her twins in her lap, their heads resting against her breast, and felt a warmth that went deeper than fire. Chatan passed by, his hand brushing the edge of her blanket in a gesture so subtle it might have been accident. But she felt it. She looked up, met his eyes, and in that unspoken moment, Something passed between them, as quiet and enduring as the mountains themselves. The danger was not gone. The riders still hunted, the world beyond the ridges still threatened. But within the circle of firelight, within the shelter of this people, Sarah no longer felt like a woman abandoned to die. She was becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone who could stand not only for herself, but for her sons. The desert had tried to break her. But here in the mountains, among healing waters and steady hearts, she began to believe in something she had thought forever lost, a future. And as the fire sank low and the stars carved their paths above, Sarah whispered to her sleeping children, promising them that whatever came next, whether shadow or light, they would not face it alone. For she had found her place in the quiet strength of those who had saved her, and perhaps in the steady presence of one man who had taught her that healing was not the absence of pain, but the courage to carry it forward into love. The valley of the sacred waters breathed in rhythms older than memory, mornings unfurled with mist rising from the hot springs, curling into the air like incense, carrying with it a healing scent that seemed to settle into every bone. Sarah found herself waking not in fear but in wonder, her sons nestled against her chest, their tiny breaths in harmony with the earth's. She was no longer the woman abandoned on cracked desert stone. She was mother, witness, and part of a circle that held her close. The people moved about their days with a quiet grace. Women gathered herbs, their voices weaving songs that lingered like threads of light. Men rode the ridges, their eyes sharp, their movements sure, always aware of danger, yet never ruled by it. Children played between the lodges, laughter ringing as bright as birdsong. And in the midst of this, Sarah learned. She learned to bead patterns that told stories, to prepare hides until they were soft as silk, to weave reeds into baskets sturdy enough to carry food and dreams alike. Each task was a lesson not only in skill, but in belonging. With each careful motion, she stitched herself into their world. Chatan was there, steady as the mountains. He did not linger by her side always, yet his presence wrapped around her like a constant shield. Sometimes she saw him across the fire, speaking with warriors, his hands drawing maps in the dirt. Other times she felt his eyes on her sons, a softness flickering across his stoic face when Henry's fists curled in sleep or James's fragile cry pierced the night. He carried their cradle-board as though it were sacred, never complaining of weight, never letting weariness show. It was not words that bound them most, but silences. When Sarah sat by the water, her hands washing cloth while the steam rose in ghostly tendrils, he would sometimes join her. He spoke little, yet his presence filled the air with calm. Once, as the twilight brushed the sky in hues of violet, he taught her the Lakota word for healing. She repeated it slowly, clumsily, but when he nodded in approval, warmth spread through her chest. She carried the word back to the twins, whispering it against their brows as though wrapping them in an unseen blanket. But the world beyond their sanctuary pressed closer. Scouts brought word of soldiers moving along the plains, of treaties broken before the ink dried, of homesteads spreading like fire through the grasslands. Fear was a shadow that never entirely left. One evening, as the council gathered, Sarah sat just outside, cradling her sons, listening to the cadence of voices she could not fully understand. She caught the sharp rise of disagreement, the low rumble of worry, the name Reynolds carried on the wind like a thorn. Her heart clenched, Her father-in-law's reach was long, his ambition deeper than grief, and she knew he would not let go of heirs so easily. Later, Shatan came to her. His face was carved with fatigue, but his voice was steady. "Council says move," he told her. "North, deeper. Soldiers come soon. Safer there." She nodded, though fear coiled tight in her belly. Moving again meant risk, meant long roads and hidden trails, meant that the men who hunted her might still draw near. Yet she saw in his eyes the same unspoken vow he had carried since the desert. She and her children would not be left behind. The days that followed were heavy with preparation. Lodges came down, bundles tied, food dried for the journey. Sarah worked as her strength allowed, folding cloth, securing the tiny moccasins Kimla had helped her make, pressing kisses against her son's brows to anchor her courage. The morning they departed, the valley seemed to watch them, steam rising like blessings, trees whispering farewells in the language of leaves. The journey north was harder than before. The terrain grew steeper, the nights colder, the trails more treacherous. Yet there was beauty in the hardship. The way the sun lit the mountain ridges in molten gold, the way streams carved silver veins through the earth, the way the stars burned so fiercely above that they seemed close enough to touch. Sarah sang softly to her sons, her voice weaving fragments of hymns and lullabies, carrying them forward with melody when her body threatened to falter. There were moments of fear. Once, distant hoofbeats thundered across the plain below, and the camp moved in urgent silence, hiding beneath rock and pine until the sound faded. Another night, Henry's cries rose sharp and piercing, and Sarah felt terror claw at her throat, certain the noise would carry to those who hunted them. Shatan pressed a steady hand to her shoulder, his calm anchoring her storm. He whispered to the boy in Lakota, a chant low and even, and miraculously the child stilled. In that moment, Sarah's heart swelled with a tenderness so fierce it startled her. Danger was not the only test. Hunger stretched them thin, storms lashed with merciless rain, and sometimes despair crept close, whispering that they were only postponing the inevitable. Yet in those same nights, Sarah found healing in the smallest things, the warmth of Kimla's hand squeezing hers, the medicine woman's sharp eyes softening with pride, the laughter of children who still found joy in the wilderness. And always Shatan's presence, sometimes near, sometimes at the edges, but always steady. One night, beneath a sky split wide with stars, Sarah sat with him apart from the others. The twins slept between them, their tiny hands curled like petals. She turned to him, her voice low but clear. "Why do you help me still? Your people risk much." He was silent for a long time, the fire casting shadows across his face. At last he spoke. "Because no one helped my wife," he said. "She carried our child. Soldiers came. I was not there. She died alone." His gaze did not falter, but his voice held the raw edge of old grief. "I will not let it be so again. Not for you. Not for them." Tears blurred Sarah's vision. She reached across the space between them, her fingers brushing his hand. He did not pull away. Their hands rested together, quiet, unassuming, yet filled with a weight greater than any promise spoken aloud. In that touch lay grief, yes, but also healing. The slow, steady mending of wounds, neither had believed could close. The trail wound on, carrying them deeper into mountains where rivers sang and eagles soared. Each day Sarah grew stronger. Each night her sons thrived, their cries louder, their eyes brighter, their bodies proof of resilience. And within her chest something grew alongside her courage, a tenderness for the man who had lifted her from death's edge, who carried her burdens without asking, who spoke more with silence than with words. Love did not announce itself with thunder or fire. It crept softly, like dawn light spilling across stone, like the steady breath of a child asleep, like the healing hum of a song half remembered. And as Sarah lay awake beneath the stars, listening to the rhythm of the camp, the heartbeat of her sons, and the steady tread of Chatan's watch nearby, she understood that love, too, was a kind of survival. It was the quiet victory of refusing to let despair have the final word. The mountains held their secrets close, but in the hush between breaths, Sarah began to believe that perhaps the path ahead, uncertain, dangerous, yet filled with light, was not something to fear. It was something to walk, step by step, together. And so the night folded around her like a blanket, and the dawn waited, ready to carry them forward into whatever healing the next day would bring. Snow fell that first morning like a whisper, soft flakes drifting from a sky the color of pewter. The mountains had tightened their grip on autumn, surrendering it to winter without hesitation, and the camp moved more slowly now, conserving strength, conserving warmth. Sarah wrapped Henry and James in furs lined with rabbit skin, pressing their small bodies against her own as if she could shield them from all that lay ahead. The air bit at her cheeks, yet she found comfort in the way her breath mingled with theirs, 3 threads woven into one warm cloud. The people adjusted with a resilience born of centuries. Fires burned hotter, deeper in pits dug against the wind. Lodges were layered with pine boughs and hides to hold heat. Food was rationed carefully, every piece of dried meat and every root a treasure. Sarah learned how to sew fur into cloaks, her fingers clumsy at first, but growing sure beneath Kimla's guidance. Each stitch was an act of survival, but also of healing, a declaration that life would continue despite the cold. Chatan took on the longest watches. She saw him often at the edge of camp, his figure a dark silhouette against the pale sweep of snow. Sometimes he carried his bow, sometimes only his knife, but always he carried the weight of protection. She knew he had lost once, yet here he stood, refusing to let history repeat itself. The steadiness of his presence warmed her more than any fire. One evening, when the storm howled through the pines and the wind shook the lodges like restless spirits, Sarah woke to the cries of her sons. She hushed them quickly, rocking them against her chest, but fear crept into her veins. The sound seemed too loud, too sharp, as if it could carry across mountains and summon those who hunted them. Chatan appeared at the entrance, snow melting from his shoulders, his eyes steady. He crouched beside her and began to hum. A low, even sound, not a tune, but a rhythm. Slowly, impossibly, the babies stilled. She watched his profile in the firelight, the strength in his jaw, the gentleness in his voice, and something deep within her shifted. Love was not sudden, it was patient, like snow laying itself across the earth, one flake at a time. As the storm raged, Sarah told him softly of her home far away, of fields green in spring and the laughter of her sisters. He listened without interruption, his silence not empty but full, a vessel to hold her memories. When she faltered, grief cracking her voice, he reached for her hand. Their fingers intertwined, rough skin against soft, and she felt as though the storm outside had less power than the warmth kindling between them. The days grew harsher. Hunters returned with less meat, their faces grim. The twins grew restless, their hunger more demanding, their cries harder to soothe. Sarah's strength stretched thin, but she refused to falter. She walked with the women to gather bark, carried water from streams half frozen, sang lullabies though her throat ached with cold. She began to sense that survival was not only about food and fire, it was about spirit, about believing that spring waited on the far side of every winter. That belief was its own healing, a warmth no frost could steal. There were moments of beauty, too. One morning she woke to see Shatan lifting Henry into the pale dawn. The baby's laugh rang out, bright as silver bells, and for an instant the entire camp seemed to pause. Warriors smiled. Women chuckled softly. Even the elders' stern faces softened. It was as if that small laugh had broken the ice not only on the river, but on the hearts around them. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, not of sorrow, but of awe, and when Shatan lowered the child back into her arms, she whispered a word of gratitude that needed no translation. The danger, however, remained close. Scouts returned with whispers of Reynolds' men, of soldiers moving through the valleys. Fear spread like a shadow, yet the people did not scatter. They prepared. Traps were set along narrow passes, trails were disguised, fires were banked to hide smoke. Sarah saw in their calm that courage was not the absence of fear, it was the will to stand even when fear pressed close. She clung to that lesson, breathing it into her sons, whispering to them that the world was cruel, yes, but also filled with those who healed, who stood, who refused to abandon. One night, when the moon carved its pale path through the storm clouds, she and Shatan walked together beyond the lodges. The snow crunched beneath their boots, the cold sharp and biting, but between them the air seemed softer. He showed her how to read tracks in the snow, the delicate lines of hare, the wide prints of elk, the sharper marks of fox. She laughed when her guesses were wrong, and he chuckled, a sound rare but rich, a sound that felt like the earth breaking open to reveal spring water. They stood close then, the silence between them pulsing with more than words. She wanted to thank him, to tell him he had given her more than protection, that he had given her reason to believe again. But the words caught in her throat, fragile as snowflakes, waiting for the right moment to fall. When they returned to the camp, she found herself watching him differently. She noticed the way his hand lingered when he brushed snow from her shoulder, the way his gaze softened when it rested on her sons, the way his silence wrapped around her, not as emptiness, but as shelter. She realized then that love had already entered her life, not with grand declarations, but with steady acts, with patience, with the healing presence of a man who chose to stay. Winter pressed on, harsh and unyielding, but Sarah's spirit no longer bent beneath it. She had carried despair once, heavy and suffocating, but here she carried something else, a fragile, growing light. It was in her son's laughter, in the people's acceptance, in the unspoken bond between her and Shatan. It was the promise that no matter how cruel the world might be, there was still love waiting in its quiet corners, love strong enough to heal, love patient enough to endure. And as snow fell again, soft as feathers, Sarah whispered to her sleeping children that the storm would pass, that warmth would return, and that together, with every step forward, they would find a life not only of survival, but of love, deep and unbreakable as the mountains themselves. The winter gave way slowly, not in one sudden burst of warmth, but in 1,000 small mercies. Snow softened into rivulets that fed the streams. The sharp bite of the wind gentled into a cool breath scented with pine and wet earth. Buds swelled on branches that had seemed dead, and birds returned, their songs threading the mornings with promises of renewal. Sarah felt the shift inside herself as surely as she saw it in the valley. Healing was not swift, but it was steady, like water carving stone. Her sons grew stronger with each day. Henry's laugh rang bright across the camp, while James's quiet gaze held a depth that seemed to reach beyond his years. They crawled now, small hands patting the ground with determination, tiny feet eager to find their way. The people adored them, passing them from one arm to another, weaving them into every circle, every song. Sarah watched with gratitude that sometimes left her breathless. These children, once nearly lost to despair in the desert, were now surrounded by love that was larger than any one heart could hold. Sarah herself was changing too. The woman who had once trembled beneath betrayal now walked with her head lifted, her steps strong. She knew how to bead patterns that told stories, how to gather herbs that soothed fevers, how to weave reeds into baskets that held more than food. They held the quiet dignity of survival. She had become not only a guest, but part of the living rhythm of this people. Chatan was still the quiet axis around which her days turned. His presence did not demand, it simply was, steady as the mountains. He taught Henry to balance upright on his broad hand, making the boy squeal with joy. He soothed James with a low hum that seemed to melt every fear from the child's small body. And when his eyes met Sarah's across the fire, there was something in that look that spoke more deeply than any words. A recognition, a promise, a love that did not need to announce itself. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of lavender and gold, the council gathered. Voices rose and fell in patterns Sarah was still learning, but she caught her own name woven among the words, followed by Chatan's. An elder spoke long, his gaze resting on them both, and when he finished, the circle nodded in agreement. Kimla explained softly to Sarah afterward. The people had chosen to bind her to them, to bind her sons, and to acknowledge the bond that had already taken root between her and Chatan. It was not forced, not demanded. It was recognition of what already lived. Sarah's breath caught. She looked to Chatan, whose face was calm, yet softened by the smallest smile. He stepped forward, standing before her in the firelight, and extended his hand. Not to claim, but to invite. She placed her hand in his, her heart racing, her spirit trembling, and in that moment the camp rose in song. Low voices, steady drums, the sound of belonging wrapping around them both. Tears streamed down her cheeks, not of sorrow, but of release. The desert was behind her now. Before her stretched not only survival, but love, quiet, patient, unbreakable. The night that followed was filled with laughter and warmth. Women danced with babies on their hips. Warriors told stories that made the children giggle. The elders shared blessings that felt like threads of gold weaving through the air. Sarah sat with her sons asleep against her chest and Shatan at her side. And for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt whole. She was no longer defined by abandonment or loss. She was defined by what she had chosen to carry forward: love, resilience, and hope. As spring deepened, the land itself seemed to rejoice. Wild flowers spread like fire across the meadows, rivers ran full and bright, and the mountains stood crowned with light. Sarah walked often to the ridge with her sons in tow, their small hands clinging to her skirts. She would stand there, gazing at the horizon, no longer with fear of pursuit, but with wonder at the life yet to come. And always beside her, Shatan stood, not in shadow, but in light, the warmth of his presence as steady as the earth beneath her feet. She whispered to her children in those moments that life was never without hardship, but hardship could be healed. She told them that love could bloom even in the harshest deserts, that family could be found in places unexpected, that hope was never truly lost. And when their eyes, bright and curious, looked up into hers, she knew they carried that truth already in their blood. The story of her survival had become the story of her love. It was not loud, not written in battles or grand gestures, but in the steady rhythm of daily life, in the healing touch of kindness, in the warmth of belonging. And it was a story that would carry forward, passed down to her sons, to the generations yet unborn. If these words have wrapped warmth around your heart, if you have felt the quiet strength of Sarah's journey and the healing power of love that grows in unexpected soil, I invite you to let your voice join this circle. Leave a comment with the thoughts this story stirred within you. Offer a like if its light touched you. Subscribe if you wish to walk with us through every story yet to come. Each small gesture is a thread, weaving us closer, reminding us all that even in the darkest deserts, love finds a way to bloom.